my name is Mary Jo Ebner. Actually, my name was Mary Jo Krause Ebner. That was my maiden name. And I was born on January the 14th, 1937 in Canton, Ohio. My parents were George Krause and Ruth Caldwell Krause. Both of them were married in 1932, and they were very, very good parents. So as I grew older, actually I ended up being an only child. But it was an interesting part of my childhood. There was a little girl next door. Her name was Joey. And Joey and I played a lot. She was exactly my age. But she was the youngest of 9 children, and her mother died of tuberculosis. So there was one day that her father had her in his hand and was crying. And my dad went over and said, "What's wrong, Grant?" He said, "I have to take these 3 children to the foster home. I can't handle it anymore." And my dad said, "Well, you're not taking Joey." So I was in the 4th grade, and Joey came to live with us. And so I had a sister for a while. For about 3 years, Joey lived with us. And my mother and my dad gave her all the same things they gave me for Christmas. If I got a doll, she got a doll. My mother and dad took care of her and made sure that she had the right food, the right vitamins. And just to jump ahead a little bit, when Joey got married, she moved to Massachusetts. And when they came back one time, she and her husband came to see my mother and dad, and her husband actually thanked my mother and dad for taking care of her, because they said because of them, she had a very healthy life. The rest of the children weren't raised as well as Joey. So I thought that was an interesting part of my childhood. I never liked being an only child, and I really don't like it now, but it is what it is. I had lots and lots of friends. I seeked out friends because I was an only child, and I had to have people. I would be lonely if I didn't have them. So I would do things probably that those children from a large family wouldn't do. And my parents were very, very good about, I'd take them on vacations with me. I'd take them to my grandmother's in Ravenna with me. So I lived a life of a good childhood life. Well, as I got into high school, back up a minute. I went to public school until I was in the 7th grade. And when I was in the 7th grade, I switched over to the Catholic schools. My mother did teach in the Catholic schools, so I don't know really why she didn't want me there, but I finally got where I wanted. And 7th grade, from then on, I always went to Catholic schools. So I went to Central Catholic High School, had a great high school years, had a great group of girlfriends, and we had parties every Friday night after the football games. And guess where the parties used to be? Yeah, my house. Never knew who was coming. So later on, if you know anything about my son, you know where he got his attitudes. So after high school, I met somebody in high school who was my best friend, or one of my good friends, and her name was Margaret Ebner. And I used to go stay all night at her house. She was from a big family, just family of 7. So I ended up, that's why my name is Ebner. I married her brother. When I graduated from high school, I had an aunt who was very influential on my life, my Aunt Louise. And she would take me, she was a nurse. She would actually take me to work with her. I would go to I remember going she was an industrial nurse. I went with her there. I went with her on public health. If I could go into the house where she was, I did. If it was a contagious disease, I just waited in the car for her. But actually, Aunt Louise was probably, she was kind of she was a tough individual, let me put it that way. But I think she influenced my life to go into nursing. So I did go into nursing, and I thought, I'll never make it because they told me it would be so hard. Well, I'll tell you what, I really studied because I think it was because my aunt was the director of the school. I studied my full head off my freshman year. So as time went on, I did graduate, but there was one day, and I remember it was June the 17th. No, it was that week. And my friend Margaret, that I told you about that I met in high school, we used to meet every Monday night. I was in nurses training downtown, and she lived close to town. And she worked at the Timken company. She was a secretary. Well, she had money. I had none. So we would go shopping, and I'd sit there and watch her buy all these clothes. And I would just die. I had a quarter in my pocket. So anyway, I would walk her home, and it was a summer night. And I walked her home, and I was sitting on her front porch on the swing, and her brother came up. Her brother had come home from college, and he came up on the porch, and I would take the bus home, and he said, "Well, where do you live?" And I said, "Well, I live out on Altman Avenue." He said, "Well, I'll take you home." He said, "Actually, I'm going there because my friend Dick Stout lives there, and that's where I was going, so I'll just drop you off." Well, you notice that my name's Ebner? That was the beginning. And that Saturday, he called me and asked me to go to Myers Lake dancing. Well, back then, Myers Lake, if you got asked to go to Myers Lake, you were in. So I got out there, and I was so excited. And that first date, I knew that was the one. And I remember him, we were on the dance floor, and I tell everybody this story. "What's your major in college?" And he said accounting, and I thought to myself, oh boy, is he in, because I hate money. And I figured he can balance my checkbook, and I would take care of him when he was sick. Well, it ended up that I graduated from nursing in 1958, August of 58. And he graduated from the University of Dayton in the spring of that year. He had gotten a job down in Dayton, and we got married in January then of 59. When we moved to Dayton, and we lived there 6 months. Oh, it was the loneliest 6 months of my life. I got so homesick. So, and actually, he wanted to come back to Canton too. So a friend of his called and said there was a job, and it was a pretty plummy job. It was a good job. He was to work with, at that time it was called Ernst & Ernst. And I had worked at the nursery in Dayton at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. So I'd only been there 6 months, and it was a good job. It was a good job. And you know what? They told me that I was the best trained new nurse that they had ever had. So I was pretty proud of that. So I left that job, came up to Canton, and I got a job then at Mercy Hospital in pediatrics. And I worked in pediatrics for about a year. And I had trouble. I wanted a baby so bad. And I had trouble. So I went to the doctor, and I got pregnant in March. And I thought, I quit in June. I quit nursing in June. I thought, I'm not going to take any chances of losing this baby. So I had this little baby. And, I was elated. I've never, ever had a feeling like that. This little baby, I thought, God, something's going to happen because life can't be this perfect. And he'd come to me, they'd bring him to me, and they'd say, I'd show everybody, "Do you see my beautiful baby?" "Oh, well, yeah, he's nice." Well, they weren't too excited like I was. So we brought this little baby home, and we decided to name him. His name actually is Thomas David, but we decided to call him David. And that is who Dave is today. Dave was just like my father. And I was so proud of this little guy. And 18 months later, I come up with this little girl, Julianne. And that was, I thought, oh boy, I'm going to have a bunch of children. Well, I never had any more. But let's back up a moment. Let's back up. I have some interesting people back in my life. I do remember my great-grandmother. I remember her very well. Her name was Elizabeth Snyder.
Yeah, let's trace back to the oldest relative that you remember.
That's who I'm thinking of. My
and where they're from.
Okay, my great-grandmother, they were from Akron, Ohio, and my great-grandfather, I never knew him. He and my great-grandmother had gotten a divorce. Actually, he went to New York, and at that time, the railroads were coming into play, and he opened barber shops in railroad stations. And if you know anything about that, this would be, much before. I was born in 37. It was much before that. Back then, a lot of men got haircuts when they were waiting on their trains. So it was a very, very flourishing business. And he started this, and he asked for my great-grandmother, Elizabeth, to come to New York, and she wouldn't go. She would not leave Ravenna, Ohio. And it ended up they got a divorce. Well, my great-grandfather, his name was Louis Roma, and he ended up being a multimillionaire. I saw pictures of him in Central Park with his chauffeur, and my grandmother. It's strange because his family did not know anything about his prior family. He had these two girls, my grandmother and her sister Louise. Well, ended up that my great-grandfather died. He lived to be 92, and he died, and my grandmother was left out of his will. Well, my grandmother could have used some money at that time. She had a tough time slugging. She would bring roomers and boarders in just to maintain her life, and it was tough. So, being as that she was his daughter, my family thought that she probably should have been in the will. So I had an Uncle Bob Cripps, who went to New York to contest the will, but it didn't work. Grandma didn't get anybody. But I thought that here I had this multi-millionaire great-grandfather and never met him. My great-grandmother was quite poor. She needed money. But anyway, that's part of my heritage. Then my grandfather, his name was Walter Caldwell. And that would be on my mother's father. He worked in Cleveland and lived in Ravenna. And one day he went to sit on the benches at the train station, and the whistle blew, and it scared him, and he fell onto the tracks and was run over by the train. My mother, Ruth, was the oldest, and she was about 21, I think, and the youngest was my Aunt Margaret, who was 7. So my grandmother was left. That's another thing about my great-grandfather. My grandmother was left with these 4 children to raise without much income back then. That's a little bit about my mother's side of the family. My grandmother was very influential in my life. I used to go to her house every summer for a couple of weeks. I went every Christmas for a week, and I was spoiled rotten. Not with material things, but I was spoiled with love. She taught me how to cook. She would take me downtown in Ravenna. We'd walk down the streets, and she would take me with her when she sang in the church choir with Francis Buccanelli. I'll never forget that one. But Grandma used to belong to garden clubs and bridge clubs, and I used to go right to garden club with her. And I think as I grew older, I belonged to garden clubs and a bridge club. And I think my grandmother was quite influential in my life. She knitted, She taught me how to knit, and I ended up knitting quite a bit of things too. So that's my grandmother and my Aunt Louise, and then my Aunt Margaret. I loved my Aunt Margaret. Those were my mother's sisters. And she had a brother, Jim. My Uncle Jim lived at a distance, so I knew him, but he wasn't that much in my life. My father's side now is a whole different story. My grandmother, I don't know anything about my grandfather, nothing at all. All my grandfathers were gone before I was born. But my grandmother Wingard, she was a pistol. She was a German, well, the kids, they didn't like her. She was one of those people that if the ball went in her yard, she kept it. And she would yell at the kids. As it so happened, Tom grew up only about 2 blocks away from my grandmother, and he remembers her. And they used to call her the Dutch cleanser, and I won't go into that story or why that is, but she had her reputation, that's for sure. But she loved me. I was the only girl, and she would hug me, and no whiskers on her chin would scratch me, and she only had one layer of teeth, and not the other. And I remember watching her chew an apple. Oh my gosh. Well, Grandma Wingard she could cook sauerkraut and the best strudel you ever ate. But she couldn't bake a cake or a pie for nothing. Anything that took gentleness, But she was, I remember, she had a tough life. She had a very tough life. She had 2 husbands, and when Grandma Wingard died and I saw her in the casket, I thought, Grandma, you are finally at peace. I didn't feel bad at all because I knew that she had a very difficult life. She raised 5 boys and 1 girl. Without that alone would be tough. And my father had to quit school when he'd gone into his freshman year. And he quit school to help my grandmother because he was the oldest of the 5 boys. And he helped take care. And he would peddle fish in the morning before he went to school. Then he'd go to school smelling like one big fish. And then he would come home, and my grandmother had done washings and ironings for people. And my father then came home from school and would deliver these washings and ironings to the people. So they worked hard. And my Uncle Carl was only a baby because he was born when my grandfather died before he was born. And they wanted to take my grandmother's 5 boys away from her. She said, you're taking my boys away. And she raised them, and it was a tough, tough time. They lived on a farm, and I can remember my mother when I was, like 8 or 10 years old, something like that. My mother used to make me go to my grandmother's and stay overnight. She lived on a farm. There was an outhouse. Oh, I just used to dread, but she said, you go to your other grandmother's, you have to go to this grandmother too. And I didn't want to go down there. But anyway, I learned later on to really respect where my grandmother came from and how hard she worked to keep her boys together. She had to be a tough lady. So I don't know really what her true personality was, but I have a lot of respect for both of my grandmothers, and they both were very different. But they took care of their families without a husband. Both had been widows. And I look at that and I think, I don't know how women would do what those women had to do. They had no money coming in. As I said, my grandmother used to do washings and things like that. So very tough life, but I do remember the farm, and I sure remember Ravenna. I remember Ravenna. I used to go up there even when I was in high school. I dated somebody for about a year that was from Ravenna. And so anyway, back up now. Now I went into nurse's training, I graduated, and I got married. And I had this little baby named Thomas David Ebner Jr. We called him David, and now he's had several names during his life, but he now is David. He's a great guy. He's now 65 years old. And I would say he is so much like my father that and I guess people tell me, and I think it's true, that David has a lot of my personality. I don't know whether that's good or bad, but he is a salesman, and I think that I could probably sell a bucket of crap on the road too. So I got married, I had these 2 children. My little Julie was perfect. I've never seen a little girl that was as perfect as she has been all of her life. But they were only 18 months apart. And I always told David that I really respected him more than she, because she was very popular in her life. She was very popular in high school. Always had a boyfriend. Always had a bunch of friends around. She was, got the homecoming attendant, got this and that. And Dave was her cheerleader. He was never, ever jealous of her. She got to go to the University of Dayton. David couldn't go there. He wasn't admitted. So he went to Walsh College. And it's kind of been their way their entire life. But I've always admired him because of how he really stood up for her. So I've got 2 great children, both at opposite ends, but very, very close to each other. I don't think they've ever had an argument. Oh yeah, they did. One over who got closest to Michael Stanley, one of the big band guys that was out of Cleveland, Ohio. And honest to John, that's the only time they ever had any kind of scrap to this day. So life went on, and I retired. I quit nursing. I remember Julie saying to me, she was in the 4th grade, and Dave was in the 5th, and she came to me and she says, "Mommy, I'm so glad you quit. Now you could be home with us." And that meant something, and I want to tell mothers that today, that it is important to be home with your children. I worked jobs that led, I never had a babysitter. I worked in nursing. I would work night shift. I would come home, and I remember one day scrubbing the carpet on the floor, and with these 2 children to try to stay awake. And I found I woke up about 2 hours later with the scrub brush in my hand and the kids playing around me. So crazy things like that would happen. But I've had good jobs. I've always worked part-time. And I always said I would work or not work for the sake of the family. When the children were little and they needed me, I was there. I worked nights, and I only worked part-time. And when they got into high school, I went to work full-time at Edwin Shaw into chemical dependency, which I would claim that was my favorite job. I loved that department of nursing. And I worked there 8 years, and I worked pretty much full-time because they were in college. And I helped pay for college, and I helped pay for Julie's wedding. So as they grew older, it came time for Tom and I. We had raised our children. We did a lot of camping with them. We loved camping. We were in a bridge group, and I tell people, if there's 2 things I would tell young people to do is go camping and play bridge. We met the nicest people that way. If you go camping, you meet family-type people, and if you play bridge, you kind of meet, we always played bridge through St. Michael's, through our church, and we'd meet so many nice people, and our church was our community. St. Michael's was our community of friends. And I became very, very active when the children were in high school and college. I became Mrs. St. Michael over there. I was involved in every ministry there was, except the liturgy committee, and there was one more, youth ministry. I said, keep me away from them kids. I don't want any part of that. So every other ministry I was a part of, and I even was parish council president at one time. So I had a lot of activity over there, and it taught me a lot. It taught me organization work. It taught me, I was around the parish life all the time. I loved it. And had a lot of friends. All my friends were revolved around St. Michael's Parish. So we had that. We had camping. We had a very happy life with our friends. We went out almost every Saturday night. We never splurged on much. But as the children got away and they had graduated from college, and one day I said to Tom, where's all this money coming from? He said, well, it's not going to St. Michael's, and it's not going to Central Catholic and Walsh College and the University of Dayton. It's coming here now. So we had the money then that we were able to travel. Consequently, we started going to Europe. We went to Italy. We went to Spain. We went to Canadian Rockies. We went to Alaska. We went to Hawaii. And we had a very nice retirement type years. Well, got to the point where we lived in Canton. And after we stopped traveling, we ended up somehow, we were in Florida for a month. And one day, we bought a condo. I still to this day, can't believe we did that. Tom was not one of those impromptu persons, but we bought a condo, and that was in the year 2004. We bought this condo, and with a 5-year plan, that we were going to make some money out of it. Well, that 5-year plan ended up with not making much money out of it, but it sure was 20 years of a great life in Florida. We'd go down for the winter months and enjoyed each other. Found another group of friends down there that we really were very enjoyed a whole lot. Partied with, cried with, sang with, and another group. So we had friends all over the country. I guess that's kind of what David is friends all over the country.
Let's take a step back and talk about your family. Why Ohio? What brought your family to Ohio?
What brought my family to Ohio?
Like, can you trace your roots back to Germany?
Well, my roots, okay, let's start with my mother's side of the family.
Yeah.
Way back when, my mother's great-grandfather, Dave, was Bach, B-A-C-H. And we think that he is related to Bach, the musician. So that comes, I guess, would be from Italy, and there's a lot of German in me. But her side of the family, I can't trace to any other country other than the United States. They were all pretty much in America. They lived in Akron, Ohio, and my grandmother and my grandfather were married very young, and they lived in Ravenna, Ohio. So my mother grew up there. So it was really, that was pretty much kind of boring, you know. It was just not a story to tell. It just kind of went on down. Now my dad's side of the family is a different story. My grandmother came over from Germany when she was, her father brought her over here when she was 12 years old and took her to Youngstown to, I think they was told it was a cousin or something. And because he wanted her to have a better life. It was going into probably, she wasn't married. So it was probably would have been the early 1900s that she came over here. I think she met my grandfather maybe on the boat, but she was a stinker. She had another boyfriend. And the story goes that this boyfriend that she had, one day they had a date and he couldn't make it. So he gave a note. You know, the communications we didn't have telephones or anything. They didn't have telephones back. So he gave a letter to this friend to give to my grandmother that he wasn't able to make this date. Well, the friend was jealous. So she did not give my grandmother the letter. My grandmother stood up. So she dumped that guy. She met this is a story I got. She dumped my guy. She met my grandfather, and they got married and had my dad. My dad, my dad was born in 1908. So one day, this guy shows up at the door, the first guy, and he wanted to marry my grandmother. My grandmother said, I can't marry you now. You know, I have a husband, and his name was George Krause too. I have a husband and I have a son, and too late.
Both were named George Krause.
Huh?
Both were named George Krause.
Yes, my dad was named after his father, George Augustus Krause. You can't get much more German than that. My grandmother's name was Sarah, and she was Sarah. I don't know what her maiden name was. I did know, but I don't remember. Well, my grandfather died in the 1918 flu, and my grandmother just had her 5th child, her boy. He wasn't even born when my grandmother died, and that's when the welfare wanted to take her boys away because she had nothing. You know, she had no husband, no nothing, and that's when she said, you don't take my boys away. Well, she married somebody later on, and I don't know what that guy's name was, but my grandmother made donuts, you know, the German donuts, and he hid them in the basement and locked the basement and wouldn't let the boys go get the donuts. And my grandmother took him by the seat of his pants and threw him out the door. She said, you don't treat my boys that way, just get out here. So they weren't married very long. Well, then she met a man named, I think his name was John Wingard, and she married him, and he was very good to the boys. And then she had another girl, Caroline, who would have been my step-aunt, whatever. And she had life okay with him, but then he died too, and I didn't know any of them. I was born after any of these. But anyway, it's kind of an interesting story how, you know, she had met my grandfather but the other guy. But they tell me this. Now, how much of this is factual, I really don't know. But they came from Germany. Both of my grandparents had come from Germany. I never knew my grandfather.
Do you know where in Germany?
What?
Where in Germany?
It was a part of Germany that was German and Austria. And I'm wondering, I often wonder if you see The Sound of Music, there's a lot that there's a part of Austria that German became occupied, and I think that's where they were. I think Romania, Romania comes in. I don't know exactly where it was. I wish I did. My uncles would know, and I didn't get that information from them before they all died. But they were, I don't know. My grandmother's, my mother's side of the family, as I said, was all born in Akron, Ohio.
And you don't know where to trace your mother's side back?
My mother's side, my grandmother, my mother's mother, that side was German and Italian. And they were born in this country, all of them. And then my grandfather, whom I didn't know, I told you was killed up by the railroad. His name was Caldwell, and he was Irish. They had Irish blood in them, but they were all born in Akron, Ravenna, Ohio too. So there's really no interesting part of.
Do you know why Akron?
Do what?
Do you know why they were all living in Akron? What brought them to Akron?
No, I don't. No, I really don't. I don't know what, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I do know that, as I said, my grandmother on my dad's side was in Youngstown, and how she got down to the Canton area, I don't know either.
Mm-hmm.
But that's, you know, everybody was from Ohio at least. There was nobody that was really unusual.
Yeah.
I think I told you about I did. I told you about my grandfather, my great grandfather. who was the millionaire.
Right.
And I never knew him either.
Yeah.
The interesting part of that, he remarried. He got married in New York. And when my grandmother, when he died, and my uncle went to contest the will, that's when his second family found out that he had a family back in Akron. They did not know that before that. So it was, hello. He had one of those, my grandmother's sister had already died, but my grandmother was still living. And she would knit sweaters for him. She had a connection, and that was called Chris Valeriani. And nobody now would probably remember, but there was a Richard Valeriani that was a NBC sports or newscaster. And that was my grandmother's cousin. So that connection, this Valeriani would keep the connection between my grandmother and her father, but his family did not know anything about my grandmother.
Wow. Did you ever meet them?
No.
Do you know anything about them?
No, I never met him. I never met any. I knew my great grandmother that he was married to, and she would go to him. Yeah, she lived to be 104. Yeah, she was an old one, and I do remember her. We have a fifth generation picture, so David and Julie were in that. They were here when she was born. So I was in my late 20s. I think I was 32 when she died. So I had a great grandmother till I was 32 years old.
Right. Julie knew her great grandmother.
What's that?
Think about that. Julie met her great grandmother.
Oh yeah. I have a picture of them, the fifth generation.
That's uncommon.
Mm-hmm. So.
All right.
Yeah. Anything else I missed, or anything else you want to know?
No, I think that's great. Thank you.
Okay. It was great. Oh, I forgot about my grandchildren though.
Oh, we can talk about them.
I know, because I always wanted 4 children, and I got 4 of the greatest grandchildren in the whole world.
More to come too.
And you know what? I always thought when I had my grandchildren, and they lived in Cincinnati, and I lived in Canton, thoughts of my grandmother came back. And I decided that I was going to have my grandchildren know me, and that I would be involved in their life like my grandmother was, and do the same things that my grandmother did. So I hope that, I even get to do that with my great-grandchildren. Pretty young, but I think it's important that grandparents have a major role in children today, because parents are many times too busy, and grandparents can sit down and really just talk to the children. Just, be grandma. And I think Juju is just a wonderful grandmother now. So, anything else?
No, I think that's great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.